right, our last video in development. So far, we've looked at basically from conception until late adolescence, and now we're going to look at emerging adulthood, which is a kind of a new phrase that we have because students and children, adolescents, are at this. We have this awkward kind of stage now where you're basically old enough to be adults, but you're not allowed to because of society. So this is basically, late teens, early 20s. This is the emerging adulthood stage. And we found this has really expanded in the last little while because, look back at 1890. If we look at puberty starting at an earlier age than it does, or later age than it does now, and marriage happening much later in life, it's about a 7.2-year interval of what we would define as adolescence today, from menarche to independence. However, when we look at 1995, which is even quite a while ago now, it's expanded into about 12 and a half years. And it does this, a lot of it, because we are maturing a lot earlier now. There's a thing called the secular trend, which is occurring. We're getting taller and we're maturing earlier in Western civilizations and industrialized countries. And marriage is happening a lot later because people just aren't in a financial or social state where they can marry. So it's extended that period of adolescence. There was a time when they said, people argued there was no stage of adolescence. And this would be the Industrial Revolution of England, where children at the age of 6 would start working in factories, so they missed out on the social and emotional aspects of being an adolescent and basically went right to adulthood. And we find, though, when we look back, that they had all kinds of issues. There's no denying that there's definitely a stage, which is adolescence. However, it's extended over time. Okay, so sexual development. So the biology is sex. This is stuff you guys, a lot of you know. The X chromosome comes from the female, and the Y chromosome can come from the male, which dictates the sex of the child, and it could be an X or a Y from the male. And the Y is going to be a male baby, X is going to be female. And the sex hormone that we have is testosterone, which makes changes in women and males. Women produce this hormone just like males do, but males produce more, and it changes things as far as aggression and sexual desirability or libido kind of thing. It seems to have more effect on women as far as that goes. Okay, but it is in both sexes. So the sexual development, when we hit puberty, the primary sexual characteristics change. The primary sexual characteristics are all of those characteristics that are directly related to reproduction, penis, vagina, ovaries, all those kinds of things that are directly related. The secondary sexual things are things that they change along with it, but they're not related to actual reproduction. So when males is broadening of shoulders, deepening of voice, pubic hair in both sexes. Females, it's like breast development, the widening of hips, those types of things. They're not directly related, but they occur at the same time, and those are the secondary sexual characteristics. Spermarchy, which is the first male ejaculation, is the big hallmark of puberty. Menarche for females. Now, in spermarchy, the first ejaculations probably aren't potent enough to cause pregnancy. However, that develops, quickly after that, and these are the ages where we can basically sexually reproduce. Here are the secondary sexual characteristics, and actually, there are both of them that happen. Menstruation, obviously, totally related to having a offspring. Pubic hair is not, so primary and secondary. Testes and penis and stuff, the changes in there are definitely related. They're primary. The larynx enlargement and facial underarm growth and pubic hair are not related. So you get the idea between primary and secondary sexual characteristics. The development occurs, about the age of 11, girls have a growth spurt, and it's the major growth spurt. There's several along the way, and even after. We find boys usually have their growth spurt around the age of 13. And What we find though is the boys continue to grow a bit longer, so they change as far as their size goes, their strength goes. Girls develop an extra layer of body fat. Boys, just get bigger and develop more muscle than the females do. So that's, a physical difference. But where the growth spurt happens, it could be at different ages. However, this is the average. And remember, this could be like a boy could have a growth spurt at 19 and a girl could have a growth spurt, at 16. It just varies on each person. The interesting thing is the timing of puberty that you go through. For girls, if you develop early physically, it puts you at a higher risk of problems because you are perceived. Girls, development and growth physically is perceived more sexual in nature. And remember, you develop, differently between physically, cognitively, and socially, and they don't go together. So you could be the same immature young lady at one point, and then, you go through this developmental stage and you look like an adult. So you're going to be exposed to more things that you're not emotionally and cognitively ready for. Whereas boys, it seems like the earlier development seems to actually be an advantage for them because it adds to athletic prowess, which is held into high esteem of students this age. The other thing is boys' development is seen as more of a maturity thing. They're expected to be more mature. They're viewed as being more mature, where girls, it's more sexual in development. And it's not fair, but that's the way it is. And the way we deal with it, girls too, when they experience menarche, they're likely to go tell somebody they're close to, a mother or a close friend, about it. Whereas when boys hit spermarchy, which is usually nocturnal emission or a wet dream, they don't usually share it with their friends. They don't get around and say, "Hey guys, guess what happened last night?" So there's different responses and there's different advantages. Usually these things, if girls especially get past that period of times where they're, if they're early maturing, they may be exposed to drugs, sexual activity at an earlier age. When they get past that, it all evens out as adults. And in fact, boys that mature later, even though when they mature earlier, that's seen as more, feminine, later on in life, it seems to give them advantages. So it evens out. There are variations in sexual development. Intersex people that have both genitalia. I mean, you can't tell. The picture of this person here, they actually, in the Pan Am Games, won a medal, and they actually were tested to see about their genetics, and it turns out they were actually male according to the sexual tests, but there is a gray area between what is male and female biologically too, and they were allowed to compete as a female. Once the idea of puberty is to reach sexual maturation, and along those, we come with this sexually transmitted diseases. AIDS, the acquired immune syndrome, definitely happens, and it's growing in people that are younger, that are just reaching sexual maturity, and the HPV virus, which there are a lot of places now are mandating, mandating inoculations for this. But why do these things happen when there's all these protections out there? It's the same thing with teenage pregnancy. Teenage pregnancy happens more than we would like it to. There are factors that happen to. There's minimal communication about birth control. We don't talk about it enough. And sexual partners don't talk about it enough because they're sort of taken into the throes of passion and it's not a thing we talk about. And there's also guilt related to sexual activity. We tend to be shy of purchasing birth control devices and protective things like condoms because there is some guilt related to sexual activity, and we're embarrassed by that. Alcohol use is highly correlated with HIV, HPV, and pregnancy. Those that tend to drink are more at risk of these things because it removes the inhibitions and thoughts. And of course, the mass media gives us norms of unprotected promiscuity. You look at it, pay attention to, primetime television. There's tons and tons of references to premarital sex, to sex with friends, and there's very rarely is there any talk about consequence to these actions. Very rarely is there any talks about, like protecting oneself during these things. And it becomes part of the norm. And we learn from TV social scripts. The sexual orientation, there's homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual. Homosexual obviously is like, same sex, heterosexual, opposite sex, bisexual is in between. There's also, like we talked earlier, there's different combinations that, are surprising to a lot of people, and a lot of people don't understand when they have not been through that. The statistics say, we used to say that, the homosexual population was probably around 10%. There was some studies that said it was closer to 15% or 19%. However, we've kind of narrowed it down. We think it's about 3%, 2 to 3% for males, and it's less for females, which leads to a lot of difficulties because they're in a minority in a society that looks down upon that orientation. So you can think, if you are a heterosexual straight person, how confusing when sexuality becomes part of your life. Imagine how confusing it would be if it's discriminated against your preference and everything else. One thing we do know, and we do concur with in the Psychological Association, is it's not a choice. It's how you are, and this is how you live, and it has nothing to do with choosing. So if you're heterosexual, it would be the same thing as we tell you to be homosexual. It would be the same thing as telling a homosexual person to be heterosexual. It just doesn't happen. When we lead into things like conversion therapies and stuff, and how unethical and how horrible they are for someone's psychology. The bisexual orientation is a lot less common, but however, it exists. Okay, the environment in sexual orientation causes lots of difficulties, but the biology and sexual orientation, what happens and what causes the sexual orientation, is we look at other species and we find there were swans that had eggs and they never hatched, and we wondered why, and we found out eventually that this couple that mates for life with swans, they were both female, so they were homosexual swans. And we find this in other species as well. There are homosexuality in all species. The gay straight brain differences, we look at the brain and we have found differences in the brains of males and females and homosexual males as clusters in the hypothalamus. The clusters are smaller in females and also in homosexual males, which may make them think the same way. The genetic influences, there could be a genetic reason. When we try to isolate a gene for this, when we look at hereditary aspects, we find if there is homosexuality on the mother's side of the family, it's more likely that that person may be homosexual. The gay straight trait differences, we look back, the prenatal influences, let's go to that first. These are big. It's the testosterone bath that happens at about 7 weeks. We're both male and female. All of us are male and female in vitro at 7 weeks. And then the Y chromosome stimulates the testosterone bath, and that changes us physically. We find about 5 months, into the pregnancy, there's that testosterone also changes our brain, and this may have something to do with it, these prenatal influences. The gay straight trait differences, when we look back at how children manifest their sexuality, like a homosexual male, we find plays more like a female. They prefer female toys and they play more like that. Whereas a female that ends up being homosexual tends to play more like a boy. We would describe them as tomboys. Doesn't mean all tomboys are homosexual or vice versa, but there is definite, trait differences which really indicate it's not a choice. The big thing is we need to be tolerant of all of these orientations and everything else, because this is what people are, and we find this is what animals are in the real world. This is a natural part of development, and we need to not discriminate against it. So what about adulthood? Here are the outcomes. You can have a look, and there we go. So physical changes. Well, the big one in females is menopause around, between 40 and 50. Or maybe some just slightly after 50 is when the eggs have all sloughed off and their levels of hormones change, and they complain about hot flashes is actually the biggest complaint, and other things, as far as mood and all that. But that's a definite change that happens in female middle adulthood, and it's usually not a problem for anybody, but it's something to expect. The other things is strength and stamina. You reach your peak at in your early 20s as far as physical stamina and that goes, and then it declines imperceptibly, probably for about 50 years, and at 70 it seems to decline a little bit more. And again, these are estimations of time. Your sensory abilities as well decline. Older people don't smell as well as younger people, and it seems to decline more at about the age of 70. Your health is usually very good, and a lot of people live healthy lives all their lives, even into their hundreds. But again, we see more risk at around the age of 70 as well. And there's neurocognitive disorders that happen. For example, Alzheimer's disease happen later in life. However, it can happen earlier. You're more at risk later, or other forms of senility and dementia. Okay, we will talk about more about these disorders in class. However, we find that with cognitive development, there's a lot of things that seem to decline. However, when we look at, recognition tasks, that information is still there. And we call these things that we've learned crystallized intelligence. How quickly we process them and everything else is called fluid intelligence. We find fluid intelligence declines in older ages, but however, your crystallized intelligence remains and in fact improves. So an older person's vocabulary will improve as they get older. When we look at this information, how we study it, there's two methods. One's a longitudinal study, one's cross-sectional. Longitudinal means if we want to find out, say, difference in intelligence between 10 and 30 years old, we'll find that aspect and we'll follow a group of 10-year-olds, like a large group, until they are 30. Now, you're going to get really good results, but obviously there are limitations to this and problems. The problems are, of course, is that it's really expensive and it takes 20 years to find your results. And you're going to lose subjects. However, your results are probably going to be pretty reliable. Another method uses the cross-sectional one, where if we look at the 10-year-olds, or maybe get a group of 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, and 30-year-olds all at the same time and study that aspect, whatever it is, intelligence or whatever. And we will look at those results as those changes. The big disadvantage with cross-sectional studies, there's a cohort effect, is those people that are 25 didn't grow up in the same conditions as somebody 10 years old. There are environmental factors that may change the outcome of what you're trying to study. However, advantageous, you get your results quickly, it's cheaper, and so on. But you can look more positively towards the results of longitudinal studies. Once we hit midlife, there's a transition. You look at, if you're 20 years old and you go to the doctor and they say you got 10 years to live, that's a tragedy. If you're 95 and you go to your doctor and say you got 10 years to live, that's a success. So there's different attitudes towards it. And one of the attitudes that are passed on, there's not really a midlife crisis for most people. They get through it. There's difficulties at every age group, and it's really not that much difference in midlife for most people. However, the social clock can put pressures on, especially on women. Social clock is like the social timing. We graduate high school, we get married, and at a certain time we have children, at a certain time we have grandchildren, at a certain time we retire. That's the social clock. And if we don't match that up, it can cause a lot of stress and problems, especially with females thinking, once they get older, they haven't had children, and there's pressure to have children and so on. And that's what a social clock is. Adults' commitments, we look at love and work. Those are the main themes that run through adulthood. There's not the big changes as far as your cognition goes and everything else, but the idea that we have intimate relationships. Those are important going through your life. And work commitments, our career. And we look at, students in high school and stuff, a lot of them are a lot more materialistic, thinking that money is going to make us happy. And research after research has shown money does not make you happy past the poverty line. Once you're past the poverty line, there's no correlation. You can make $1 billion a year, or whatever your poverty line is, $50,000 a year, you're going to be just as happy. Or it's not going to dictate whether you're happy or not. So, work related to your interests and that you enjoy makes a big difference. People that, have a career of something that they love to do and work, they don't feel like it's a job. And that's really important in adulthood for happiness. And we look at, the happiness that people report, the well-being across the lifespan stays pretty similar all through life. But we look at the older age groups, and actually they have more life satisfaction. Probably because they've done more, and we understand when we get older, death becomes part of our existence. We're not going to live to 200 years old. We're not going to live to 150. We're going to die eventually, and we understand that. We also are experienced as we get older, death of parents, death of siblings, death of friends. We get used to that. And we all grieve in different ways. And one of the things that you should know is that we don't all grieve in the same way. There's not a staged grieving. We all grieve differently. And it's something that's important for us to do, and we get past it in our own kind of ways. All right, so that is our development unit. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of review, and it's time for a test coming up. So we'll see you guys next time in class. All right, goodbye for now.